If you've been following any kind of game-related news in the last few years, you probably know that a recurring issue game studios are facing is the rising costs of game development, which has resulted in studios shuttering and downsizing from not being able to make a profit, the development time of games becoming exponentially longer, online titles getting completely removed from stores with no way to play them through official means, and so on and so forth. All because some executives never considered the idea of making something that isn't a AAA title. One of the lesser effects of this has been a noticeable absence of licensed games. What was once a fairly dominant presence within the gaming ecosystem has not only massively dissipated in the ensuing years, but the quality of them has become more polarized than ever, either being surprisingly good or the most bottom-of-the-barrel shovelware trash, with next to nothing in between. It's hard to explain if you weren't there for it, but back then not only were licensed games prevalent, there was also next to no limits on what could be licensed, something that's sorely lacking nowadays due to the previously mentioned rising costs of development having effectively made it so that companies will only bother with something that is almost guaranteed to make money no matter what. When back then, if you could think of any franchise or medium, there's a fairly high chance a game for it existed, which also resulted in a lot of games that you would take one look at and go, why? So how about you come along with me as I take a look at some of the more stranger licensed games, some from what was licensed and others for the story behind them. Included for free as part of the December 1993 issue of the gaming magazine Amiga Power, Nipper vs. the Cats was a platformer developed by the company Graft Gold, the title's creation being to promote the opening of Level 1, a dedicated video game store owned by HMV, a chain of music and entertainment stores that have been operating in the UK since 1921. The game itself is fairly simple. It's seeing you play as Nipper, the dog from HMV's logo, which is based on the painting His Master's Voice, who has to get back the various products that a group of thieving cats have stolen ahead of Level 1's opening, the end goal being to score as many points as possible in 3 minutes. Overall, it's a fine enough game, the small amount of content on offer being due to the fact that it was a free game used for a contest, with a cash prize of £1,000. In fact, the game itself is effectively a smaller scale reskin of one of Graft Gold's previous titles, specifically 1992's Fire and Ice, the whole thing only taking about a month to complete. At this point you might be thinking, okay, it's kind of weird they made a game based on the mascot for a music store, which itself was based on a painting of a real dog, but what makes this any weirder than any other game based on a brand mascot like the Cool Spot or Pepsi Man games? You remember how I said this game was made for a contest? Well, thanks to a quote from Jason Page, the composer of various Amiga games, including Fire and Ice, we know that this contest turned into an utter shit show. For the short version, the game supplied for people to play at the store's grand opening were prototypes that contained a bug which would cause the game to crash the moment you kicked an enemy off screen, which is pretty bad considering that's one of the 3 things you do in the game. One of the event's guests, Dexter Fletcher, ended up getting kicked out after he tried to steal games, and the people were so poorly behaved that staff were finding unfinished drink cans and food hidden behind some of the games on display. And if all of that wasn't enough, the Amiga Power issue that the finished copies were distributed with got recalled twice, due to the magazine getting into a spat with the Royal British Legion due to them using a poppy on the front cover in relation to the game Cannon Fodder, which caused offense due to the flower being a symbol of remembrance for soldiers that died during times of war, especially in Commonwealth countries like the UK, Canada and Australia, resulting in the issue selling less copies than usual. One last thing, apparently this wasn't the only corporate reskin of Fire and Ice that Graft Gold made, as they also did one for the energy company PowerGen, now named Eon UK, and due to it only being available to play at their venues on events like school trips, the PowerGen game is actually lost media, so if you're interested in playing another watered down version of Fire and Ice and want to risk raiding a British power plant on the off chance they still have an Amiga game lying around, what's wrong with you? But yeah, that exists as well, I guess. Biker Mice from Mars was a kids show about... Well, what do you think it's about from the title? It got 65 episodes across 3 seasons from 1993 to 96, along with a revival in 2006 that only got 1 season of 28 episodes. From what I can tell, the show was decently popular for the time, being one of those action-oriented shows starring anthropomorphic animals that popped up after the success of the Ninja Turtles. Personally, I've never heard of it before, though that's probably due to the fact I was born in 2002. Unsurprisingly, given it was a kids show in the 90s, there were a few games made to cash in on it. The one we're interested in being a racing game for the Super Nintendo, which released in 1994 and was made by Konami. Now, normally there wouldn't really be anything to talk about with this game, it's just a fairly solid isometric racer, which has a pretty cool mechanic where you can use the prize money you earn between races to buy upgrades for your vehicle. So there's nothing too out of the ordinary, assuming you played the American version of the game. For some reason, Konami felt they needed to get a sponsor for the PAL release, ultimately getting one with the food company Mars, and because of that, this version of the game is filled to the brim with ads for Snickers chocolate bars. For a full list of the alterations, a splash screen is added on boot up notifying the sponsor. The character select screen not only changed the main platform from purple with a yellow star to the Snickers logo, but all the character sprites have been completely redone, changing them from headshots to showing their torso, with every character also holding a Snickers bar. The armor you could buy from the store and the invincibility star item have been swapped out for Snickers. Before the results screen, the race's winner spouts their love for the chocolate, with the message being the exact same every single race, regardless of who won, and 3 of the game's 5 course themes added Snickers ads as part of the background, namely the Sewers, Circuit, and Fortress theme tracks. This incredibly strange product placement is arguably the thing the game is most well known for, other than the weirdly violent game over screen. So I guess the blatant selling out isn't all bad, but I am slightly confused as to why out of all things to be chosen for product placement, they went with a chocolate bar, especially when chocolate is potentially toxic for mice in large quantities. Gotta love the irony of the defensive items having the potential to kill the title heroes. Releasing in arcades in 2014, along with later home ports for the PlayStation 3 and Vita, Dengeki Bunko Fighting Climax is a fighting game featuring characters from various franchises owned by the Japanese light novel publisher Dengeki Bunko, with the game having characters from franchises such as Sword Art Online, A Certain Magical Index, and Oremo, who have been summoned to help save various worlds from an evil force. Based on that description alone, that doesn't seem too out of the ordinary. Anime fighters are a dime a dozen. In fact, it's arguably more surprising when an anime doesn't have one. But there are also being a good handful of crossover anime games, primarily ones between the various Shonen Jump series. So, am I just picking on this game due to being generally unknowledgeable on anything anime related outside of Dragon Ball, Fist and North Star, and JoJo? Well, there's one little detail I left out of that explanation, namely that the Dengeki characters weren't summoned to save their own worlds, but instead to save the worlds of various Sega games, specifically being called by an anime girl version of the Dreamcast from a multimedia franchise called Sega Hard Girls, which coincidentally also had a light novel series published by Dengeki Bunko. From that detail, you'd probably expect this to be a Marvel vs. Capcom deal, but no. Out of the 20 playable characters in the game, only 2 of them are from Sega franchises, namely Akira Yuki from Virtua Fighter and Salvaria Bless from Valkyria Chronicles, who are only here because the final boss of the arcade mode transforms into one of them, with it being explained that they were some of the heroes previously summoned by the Dreamcast girl to fight him. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, every single stage comes from a Sega game, with none being from Dengeki Bunko, with locales such as Green Hill from Sonic, Bellbridge from Knights, and Arcs from Phantasy Star Online 2. To compare this to those Shonen Jump crossover games, imagine if one of them had Goku, Naruto, Luffy, and the others being summoned to help save the worlds of Bandai Namco games, but then the only Namco characters you can play as are Kazuya Mishima and Luke Fonfabre. It's like having a crossover where none of the characters ever actually meet each other, which brings to question why the Sega stuff is even here. And as far as I can find, it seems to just boil down to Sega using their position as the game's publisher to hijack a title that was supposed to serve as a celebration for Dengeki's 20th anniversary. Or in other terms, Sega tried to make another company's birthday about themselves. I am kinda curious how people who actually know about Dengeki's output feel about this, as I can only vouch for the Sega side of things, and the only complaint I can accurately give is Yakuza once again getting snubbed from one of these crossover titles. I really like Yakuza if you couldn't tell from my previous output. Okay, this one is a bit of a long story, so just bear with me. So in the late 90s, publisher Virgin Interactive, specifically the company's American branch, and developer Paradox Development were making a fantasy sports title for the PlayStation, based on the Mesoamerican ball game called Earth Monster. Over time, this then shifted to instead be a fighting game called Thrill Kill, which, if you couldn't tell from the name, was meant to capitalize on the wave of ultra-violent fighters that came about after the success of Mortal Kombat, with its art style taking a lot of inspiration from BDSM culture, the story seeing a bunch of people in hell fighting each other for the chance of a resurrection. The title would end up becoming infamous ahead of its release when it became not only one of the first games to receive the ESRB's AO, or Adults Only rating, but it was specifically the first game to receive that rating purely for its violent content, a feat that has only been done by 3 other games since, with the unreleased original cut of 2005's The Punisher, the PC version of 2007's Manhunt 2, and 2015's Hatred. Though, despite the widespread press this caused, it did lead to both Virgin and Paradox trying to tone down certain aspects so it could be re-evaluated for a mature rating, as most stores would outright refuse to sell a game with an AO rating. And eventually, the game was set to release in October 1998. But then just 2 months before the release date, Virgin's American branch would end up being bought by EA, with the publishing rights also being transferred to them. And after taking just one look at the game, despite the release date being so close, with some stores having already taken on pre-orders for it, they decided to cancel it, fearing the game's release would damage their reputation, most likely out of fear of the rising stigma against violent video games in the media, with them also refusing to sell the title for anyone else to publish. However, in addition to near-complete builds of the game eventually finding their way online, Paradox would end up reskinning the game and sold it a year later after being brought on to make a game for Activision, with all the violent sinners of hell being swapped out for members of the American hip-hop group, the Wu-Tang Clan, which released in 1999 as Wu-Tang Shaolin Showdown or Wu-Tang Taste the Pain in Power Regions, with there even being a special edition set of the game that came with a PS1 controller shaped like the group's logo. And now you know why there's a fighting game starring Old Dirty Bastard. As for if the game is any good, like, as one of the earlier 3D fighting games, especially one that was originally designed for up to 4 players, it's fine. But nowadays, if you want to play a 3D fighter, you can just get Power Stone. Or if you want a licensed game of that style, you can play Shrek Super Slam. And if you specifically want a fighting game starring US hip-hop artists, then play Def Jam Fight for New York. Hell, the Def Jam games even feature a few Wu-Tang members like Ghostface Killah and Method Man. I think that will do it for today, but feel free to comment about any other interesting licensed games, whether that be for the concept or the strange stories behind them. In the meantime though, I don't know, play something like Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii or something?